My name is George, and I'm 58 years old. For most of my life, I thought I had everything figured out, a fulfilling career, two incredible kids, and a marriage that had lasted 35 years. Emily, my wife, and I built a life together that I thought was unshakable. We'd face challenges, no doubt, but I believed we'd come out stronger every time. Looking back now, I realize how blind I was to the cracks forming beneath the surface. We met when I was 23. Emily was 20, working at a small cafe near the construction site where I was earning my way up as a contractor. She caught my eye the moment I walked in, something about the way she carried herself. Confident but approachable, with a laugh that could light up the whole room. I started eating there every day, even if I wasn't hungry, just to see her. It took weeks before I worked up the courage to ask her out. To my surprise, she said yes. The early days of our marriage were a struggle. We were young, broke, and figuring things out as we went along. Emily always believed in me, even when I doubted myself. It was her encouragement that pushed me to start my own construction company. Over the years, it grew into something I could be proud of. We raised our kids in the home I built, and as they grew older, so did our accomplishments as a family. At least, that's how I saw it. Recently, though, something felt different. Emily had started working more hours at her event planning job, which I initially thought was just part of her role. But the late nights began to feel like more than just overtime. She was spending more time on her phone, often stepping out of the room to take calls. There were moments when I'd catch her smiling at a text, only for her expression to shift when she noticed me watching. I wanted to trust her. After all, trust was the foundation of everything we'd built together. But trust is a fragile thing. It takes years to create and can be shattered in an instant. One night over dinner, I decided to ask her about it. "You've been putting in a lot of hours lately," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Is work really that demanding right now?" Her answer came with a dismissive laugh. "You know how it is, busy season," she said, not even looking up from her plate. It wasn't like her to avoid eye contact, and the dismissiveness in her voice left me uneasy. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The Emily I thought I knew had always been open with me. This new, distant version of her felt like a stranger. Still, I couldn't bring myself to confront her any further. Instead, I told myself it was nothing, that maybe I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. The uneasy feeling I had was becoming impossible to ignore. I'd always prided myself on trusting Emily, but something wasn't sitting right with me. These weren't dramatic changes or obvious betrayals, at least, not yet. It was the little things, the ones you wouldn't notice unless you were paying close attention. But once you did, they were impossible to unsee. Emily used to be completely relaxed about her phone. She'd leave it on the kitchen counter, sometimes even forgetting where she'd put it. Now, it was always with her. It didn't matter if she was cooking, watching TV, or even stepping out to grab the mail. If her phone buzzed, she'd glance at it immediately. I noticed she'd started locking it more often too. That wasn't like her. One evening, I saw her smiling at something on the screen. Her fingers were flying across the keyboard, typing faster than I'd seen her type before. "Who's that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, just some co-workers," she replied quickly, her tone light, but her expression wasn't. She barely made eye contact before setting the phone face down on the coffee table. I wanted to brush it off, but her reaction stuck in my mind. I've known Emily for most of my life, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that she isn't a good liar. Over the years, I've seen her try to hide little surprises from me, like birthday presents or Christmas gifts, and she always gave herself away with the smallest details. This felt different, though. It wasn't the innocent kind of secret keeping. It was something else, something heavier. Then there was her sudden interest in her appearance. Don't get me wrong, Emily has always been naturally beautiful, but she was never one to obsess over her looks. Lately, though, she'd started wearing new outfits and buying expensive skincare products. At first, I thought she was just indulging herself a little, and I didn't mind. I even complimented her. "You look amazing," I said one evening as she came downstairs in a dress I didn't recognize. She smiled faintly, murmured a quick thanks, and then left for another late meeting. That was when it hit me, she never used to dress like that for work. The late nights started piling up. "Busy season," she'd say, whenever I asked about her long hours. But her answers felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for my questions. It all came to a head on a Friday. I'd planned a quiet dinner for us at home. I cooked her favorite, salmon with roasted vegetables, and set the table like I always did, with a glass of wine waiting. She came home nearly 2 hours late. "I already ate," she said casually, tossing her purse onto the couch. "You didn't think to let me know?" I asked, struggling to keep my frustration in check. She looked at me with an expression I didn't recognize. "I didn't think it was a big deal," she said flatly. That moment lingered in the air long after she'd gone upstairs. I sat at the table, staring at the untouched food, wondering how things had gotten to this point. Emily wasn't just distant, she was shutting me out completely. And I couldn't help but feel that something was waiting just beyond the horizon, something I wasn't ready to face yet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The little signs, the changes in her behavior, they were all adding up to something I didn't want to admit. But ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. If I kept turning a blind eye, I'd be complicit in my own humiliation. That Saturday morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Emily had left early, saying she had errands to run. She barely looked at me on her way out the door, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. As soon as she was gone, I went to her home office. She'd recently started spending a lot of time in there, claiming she needed privacy for her work calls. I didn't expect to find much, but it felt like the right place to start. Her laptop was sitting on the desk, the screen closed but not locked. I hesitated for a moment, knowing this was crossing a line, but the knot in my stomach told me it was necessary. I opened the screen, and the desktop came to life. A flurry of emails, notifications, and files cluttered the screen. Most of it looked like typical work-related stuff, spreadsheets, invoices, and event plans. But then I noticed a folder tucked away in the corner, labeled Personal. I clicked it. Inside were dozens of photos, screenshots, and messages. The first image was of Emily at what looked like a rooftop bar, dressed in an outfit I'd never seen before. She was smiling, holding a glass of wine, and leaning closer to a man I didn't recognize. My chest tightened as I scrolled through more pictures of them together, at restaurants, at what appeared to be a hotel lobby, even a selfie of them sitting in a car. Then I found the messages. Some were short and vague, "I can't wait to see you again," or "last night was amazing." Others were painfully explicit, leaving no room for interpretation. My hands were trembling as I read through them. The timestamps went back months, far longer than I had suspected. She hadn't just drifted away, she'd been building a whole other life right under my nose. I slammed the laptop shut and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. Every rational part of me wanted to stay calm, but the anger bubbling inside was impossible to ignore. How long had she been doing this? How many times had she looked me in the eye, lied to my face, and walked out the door to meet him? I needed answers. But I also needed proof. If this was what I thought it was, I wasn't going to confront her unprepared. I grabbed my phone, took pictures of everything I found, and backed up the files to a flash drive I had lying around. That evening, when Emily came home, I pretended nothing had happened. She greeted me with a distracted hi and went straight to her office. I stood in the kitchen, watching her through the crack in the door, wondering if she had any idea that I knew. But I wasn't going to act just yet. No, I needed to know more, who he was, how long this had been going on, and just how deep the betrayal ran. Whatever was coming next, I wasn't going to let it blindside me again. For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. Every time I looked at Emily, I saw the man in those photos. I pictured them laughing together, sharing secrets, maybe even mocking me behind my back. The betrayal was consuming me, but I knew I couldn't let her see it. Not yet. I spent hours going through the files I'd backed up from her laptop. There were more photos, more messages, and even a receipt for a hotel stay just last month. The timestamp matched a night she'd told me she was working late on a big event. It was like reliving the moment I first discovered everything, over and over again. But this time, instead of despair, I felt something sharper, determination. I needed to find out who he was. His face was in almost every picture, but I didn't recognize him. He wasn't one of her co-workers I'd met at company parties. Whoever he was, he'd managed to slide into her life without me noticing, and that only fueled my anger. One of the text messages gave me my first lead. "Can't wait to see you at Vinoteca Friday," it read. I checked the date, it was coming up in 2 days. My heart raced as I realized this was my chance to catch them in the act. On Friday evening, I told Emily I'd be working late at the office. She barely acknowledged me, too busy scrolling through her phone. I watched her get ready as if I weren't even in the room. She pulled out a dress I'd never seen before, a sleek, black number that hugged her in all the right places. She took her time with her hair and makeup, humming to herself in a way that felt painfully familiar. It reminded me of how she used to get ready for date nights with me. When she left, I followed. I kept my distance, driving a few cars behind her. She didn't notice me, completely absorbed in her own world. I felt a pang of bitterness as I realized how easy it was for her to go about her life like nothing was wrong. She parked outside a small, dimly lit wine bar. I waited a few minutes before stepping out of my car and walking toward the window. The place was cozy, with warm lighting and small tables scattered throughout. And there they were, sitting at a corner table, heads close together. I stayed outside, watching. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, her hand lightly touching his as they talked. The man leaned in closer, and she didn't pull away. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time for confrontation. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Every angle, every interaction, I documented it all. If she wanted to lie, I'd make sure she couldn't deny the truth. When I got back to my car, I sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel. The anger was there, boiling just beneath the surface, but it wasn't alone. There was also a strange, cold clarity. For the first time in days, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I parked my car across the street from the boutique hotel, staring at the entrance as if I could will it to give me answers. Emily and the man, David, as I would later learn, had vanished inside almost an hour ago. My mind kept replaying the way she laughed with him, the way her hand brushed his as they walked. It was a scene burned into my memory, and I hated every second of it. I wanted to storm in, to demand an explanation, but I knew that wasn't the answer. This wasn't about catching her in a screaming match. This was about making sure there was no escape, no way for her to lie her way out of it. As I sat there, the anger inside me hardened into something colder, a resolve. I pulled out my phone and took photos of the hotel entrance, capturing the name of the building and the time. These weren't just pictures, they were evidence. If Emily thought she could deny this, she had no idea who she was dealing with. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the dim glow of the table lamp casting long shadows across the room. On the coffee table in front of me were the photos, the messages, and the receipts I'd collected. They were like puzzle pieces, each one fitting perfectly to reveal the truth. But there were still gaps, questions that needed answers. Who was this man? How did they meet? How long had this been going on? I wasn't going to sit and wait for the answers to fall into my lap. The next morning, I made a call. I'd never hired a private investigator before, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The man on the other end of the line listened carefully as I explained my situation. He asked detailed questions about Emily's schedule, the places she frequented, and any information I had about the man she was seeing. His calm, methodical tone reassured me that I was doing the right thing. "Give me a week," he said. "I'll find out everything you need to know." Waiting was the hardest part. I went through my days like a robot, trying to act normal whenever Emily was around. She didn't seem to notice the tension in the air, too preoccupied with her phone or her sudden work meetings. Every time she left the house, I wondered if it was to see him again. A week later, the investigator called. His voice was steady, professional, as he laid out the results of his findings. Emily and David had met over a year ago at a charity event. She had been organizing the auction, and he was a wealthy donor. From there, their relationship had grown: late-night dinners, weekend getaways, even a second phone Emily used to hide their conversations. But the most shocking detail was David's own life. He wasn't just some random fling. He was married. His wife, Claire, had no idea about the affair. The weight of it all hit me like a punch to the gut. Emily wasn't just betraying me, she was complicit in ruining someone else's life too. When I hung up the phone, I didn't feel the rage I'd expected. Instead, there was a strange calm, like the eye of a storm. I wasn't just going to confront Emily, I was going to destroy the web of lies she had built. I sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and began writing. Names, dates, locations, everything I knew. If Emily and David thought they could keep this hidden, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I didn't have to wait long to get the full picture. The investigator sent me a detailed report, complete with photos, documents, and a timeline that painted a clear picture of Emily's betrayal. As I read through the file, I could feel the walls of the life I thought I had built closing in around me. David wasn't just her lover, he was her partner in an elaborate lie. Their relationship hadn't just grown out of chance encounters or fleeting flirtations, it had been meticulously planned and nurtured. The timeline stretched back over a year, filled with stolen moments and carefully coordinated excuses. Late-night meetings, weekend trips, even dinners at restaurants we used to go to together. One detail stood out above the rest, and they weren't just meeting in secret. David had been to my house. Not while I was home, of course, but during those afternoons when Emily claimed she was working from home. The thought of him sitting on my couch, drinking coffee from my mugs, made my blood boil. But the most painful discovery was the fact that Emily had used our shared resources to fund their escapades. Hotel bills charged to our credit card, dinners paid for with joint accounts, it was like a slap in the face every time I saw another line item on the investigator's report. For a moment, I wanted to confront her right then and there. To throw the report in her face and watch her scramble for excuses. But I knew better. I wasn't just going to expose her lies, I was going to dismantle the life she thought she had so carefully constructed. I started with David's wife, Claire. The investigator had included her contact information in the report, and after a few minutes of hesitation, I dialed her number. When she answered, her voice was kind, unsuspecting. It made what I was about to say that much harder. "Claire," I began, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I think we need to talk about your husband, David." At first, there was silence. Then came the cautious response, "Who is this?" I explained everything. The affair, the timeline, the proof I had in my possession. Claire didn't cry, didn't yell. She listened in stunned silence as I laid it all out. By the time I finished, her voice was trembling, but there was a quiet strength in it. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. I had no idea. Neither of us spoke for a moment, the weight of the truth settling between us. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading, "What are you planning to do now?" "I'm going to confront them," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. they don't get to walk away from this like nothing happened. Claire hesitated before responding. Let me know when. I want to be there. Her words took me by surprise, but they sparked an idea, one that could take this confrontation to a whole new level. If Emily and David wanted to play games, they were about to find out I wasn't just a passive spectator. That night, as Emily came home and greeted me with her usual distracted smile, I couldn't help but think about what was coming. She had no idea what I had planned. No idea that her carefully woven web of lies was about to collapse around her. I couldn't shake Claire's words, let me know when. I want to be there. At first, I wasn't sure if involving her was the right thing to do, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. She deserved the truth as much as I did. And together, we could turn the tables on Emily and David in a way they'd never see coming. That night, I sat at the dining table, pen in hand, and began mapping out my plan. Every move had to be calculated. I didn't just want to confront them, I wanted to shatter the illusion they had built around themselves. I wanted them to feel the weight of their choices, to understand that their selfish actions didn't just hurt me. First, I reached out to Claire again. We agreed to meet in person, away from prying eyes, to coordinate our efforts. When I saw her, she looked like someone who had been blindsided by a freight train. Her eyes were tired, and her hands trembled as she clutched a notebook filled with her own notes and suspicions about David. He told me he was working late, she said bitterly, flipping through the pages. All those nights I waited up for him, thinking he was doing this for us, for our future. And now I find out he was with her. I nodded, feeling a pang of guilt for my own part in this twisted reality. They've been lying to both of us, I said. But they're not going to get away with it. We decided the confrontation would happen at one of their favorite meeting spots, an upscale restaurant they frequented, according to the investigator's report. Claire and I would arrive separately, each bringing our own proof, and confront them together. The days leading up to the event were some of the longest of my life. Emily continued her routine, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. Every time she smiled at me or kissed me goodbye, I felt a mix of anger and anticipation. I wanted her to feel the same shock I'd felt when I discovered the truth. Finally, the night arrived. I dressed sharply, ensuring I looked composed and confident. This wasn't about creating a scene, it was about reclaiming my dignity. Claire and I met outside the restaurant, exchanging a silent nod before stepping inside. The place was dimly lit, filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the clinking of glasses. It didn't take long to spot them. Emily and David were seated at a corner table, leaning close to each other, their heads almost touching. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to remain calm. Claire and I approached their table together. The moment Emily looked up and saw me, her face went pale. David froze, his hand hovering above his glass of wine. "Having a good time?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. Emily stammered, What are you doing here?" Claire dropped a folder on the table, the papers spilling out, photos, texts, hotel receipts. "We could ask you the same thing," she said, her voice sharp. David's face turned bright red as he reached for Emily's hand, but she pulled away, her eyes darting between the two of us. The restaurant had gone silent, all eyes on our table. "You lied to both of us," I said, my voice rising just enough to cut through the air. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed her, and you betrayed the lives we built." Emily tried to respond, but I held up a hand. "Don't. I've heard enough lies to last me a lifetime." The silence was unbearable. Emily sat rigid, her eyes wide and her face pale, as though all the color had drained out of it. Her lips moved soundlessly, searching for words that wouldn't come. David's posture mirrored her unease, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Around us, the once lively restaurant had fallen completely quiet. The other patrons, though pretending not to stare, were unmistakably watching the scene unfold. Claire, standing tall and composed, finally broke the silence. Her voice was razor-sharp, each word deliberate. So? Are you going to explain yourselves? Emily blinked rapidly, as if the question had shaken her back to reality. George, she stammered, her voice barely audible, this isn't what it looks like. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. It's not what it looks like, I repeated, the bitterness in my tone cutting through her denial. Emily, I have photos. Text messages. Hotel receipts. Should I go on, or do you still want to insult my intelligence? David shifted uncomfortably, trying to interject. Look, he started, raising his hands as though pleading for mercy. Let's all just sit down and talk this through. There's no need to cause a scene. Claire's laugh was cold, almost mocking. No need to cause a scene, she repeated. How rich, coming from the man who's been lying to me for over a year. You didn't seem so concerned about scenes when you were sneaking around behind my back. David's face turned crimson, and he lowered his gaze to the table. Emily, meanwhile, kept glancing around the room, her panic evident. I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind as she desperately tried to come up with an excuse, or an escape plan. You've been lying to me for months, I said, my voice quiet but steady. You've been lying to Claire. You've betrayed everything we built, everything I thought we had. For what? Emily's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might try to deny it again. But instead, she reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over mine. I pulled back before she could touch me. Don't, I said firmly. You don't get to act like the victim here. The restaurant staff began hovering at the edges of the room, unsure whether to step in or leave us to settle it ourselves. I ignored them. My focus was locked on Emily and David, the two people who had turned my life into a lie. This isn't just about the affair, I continued, my voice rising slightly. It's about the lies, the deception, the complete lack of respect. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could just keep living this double life, and I'd be none the wiser? Emily tried to speak, but Claire cut her off. We're done listening to excuses, she said sharply. You've lied enough. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, thick with evidence. Photos, texts, receipts, it was all there. I placed it on the table in front of Emily, the sound of it landing seeming louder in the heavy silence. This is everything, I said evenly. Everything you've tried to hide. You can't deny it anymore. David's mouth opened as if to argue, but Claire slammed her hand on the table, silencing him. Don't even try, she said coldly. We're done. You can explain this to your lawyer. Emily turned back to me, her tears spilling over now. George, please, she whispered. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work on things. I love you. I shook my head slowly. If you loved me, Emily, you wouldn't have done this, I said. You wouldn't have lied to me, disrespected me, or destroyed everything we built. This isn't something you fix. This is something you live with. I stood, the weight in my chest suddenly lighter. We're done, I said simply, before walking away. Claire followed close behind, her steps purposeful and unyielding. As we stepped into the cool night air, Claire turned to me, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Thank you, she said quietly. For telling me. For giving me the chance to face this. I nodded, unable to find the right words. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a strange, hollow feeling. But as I got into my car and drove away, one thought kept repeating in my mind, this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of their reckoning. After the confrontation at the restaurant, I didn't feel the closure I'd hoped for. Instead, there was a restless energy coursing through me, a need to do more. Exposing Emily and David publicly was satisfying in the moment, but it wasn't enough. Their betrayal had cost me my peace, my trust, and years of my life, and they were going to pay for every second of it. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder of evidence I had collected. Inside were the photos, the messages, the receipts, everything that showed just how deeply they had deceived me. But it wasn't just about me anymore. This was about accountability. It was about making sure they understood that their actions had consequences. I started with Emily. Over the years, I'd made sure our finances were solid, but now I realized how much of that stability she had taken for granted. I called my attorney, laying everything out: the affair, the misuse of joint finances, the betrayal of trust. I want a clean break, I told him. And I don't want her walking away with a dime more than she's legally entitled to. My lawyer was efficient, his voice calm as he explained the next steps. By the end of the call, I felt a sense of control I hadn't experienced in weeks. Emily had used my resources to fund her affair, now it was time to reclaim what was mine. But I wasn't stopping there. David wasn't just a side character in this mess, he was an active participant. Using the information provided by the investigator, I found out where he worked. It was a well-known firm that prided itself on integrity and professionalism. It didn't take long to figure out how to reach his superiors. I spent the next hour composing an email, attaching copies of key evidence, photos of David with Emily at the hotel, screenshots of their messages, and receipts for their dinners, charged to my credit card. The email was concise but clear, outlining how his actions reflected poorly not only on him but also on the company. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, imagining the fallout. A man like David, so concerned with appearances, wouldn't survive the scandal. The final piece of my plan involved Claire. We hadn't spoken since the restaurant, but I knew she was just as determined as I was to hold them accountable. When I called her, she didn't hesitate to answer. "Are you ready to take this all the way?" I asked. "More than ready," she replied, her voice steady. "He doesn't get to walk away from this unscathed." Together, we coordinated our next moves. Claire filed for divorce, just as I had. We shared evidence, ensuring that both Emily and David would face the legal and social consequences of their actions. But we didn't stop there. Claire decided to confront David's employer directly, using the same evidence I had provided to ensure his reputation would take a hit. Emily tried to reach out to me in the days that followed. At first, it was through texts, short, pleading messages asking me to talk. Then came the voicemails, her voice cracking with emotion. "George, please," one message began. "I know I messed up, but I can't lose you. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects of our actions became clear. Emily's friends began to distance themselves as word of the affair spread. David's employer conducted an internal review, and he was quietly let go. Claire and I, though still dealing with the fallout in our own ways, found a sense of closure in knowing we hadn't let them get away with it. For the first time in what felt like forever, I woke up one morning and felt lighter. The anger was still there, but it wasn't consuming me anymore. It had become a reminder, a lesson, even, that I could survive betrayal. That I could rebuild. Weeks had passed since the restaurant confrontation, and the fallout had been more satisfying than I'd imagined. Emily and David's lives were unraveling, thread by thread. But this wasn't just about watching them suffer, it was about closure. About ensuring that every ounce of pain they'd caused me was mirrored back to them. Emily had moved out of the house after I filed for divorce. I didn't give her the luxury of lingering or trying to convince me to reconsider. Her attempts to apologize had grown increasingly desperate, but I saw them for what they were, an attempt to salvage her image, not to atone for her actions. One day, I received a text from her. "George, can we please talk? Just one conversation. I need you to understand how sorry I am." I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. There's nothing left to say, Emily. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them. For David, things had taken an even sharper turn. The letter I sent to his firm had done its job. He'd been quietly dismissed, and though the company didn't make a public statement, the whispers had spread through his professional circle. His reputation was in shreds, and the high-paying job he'd once boasted about was gone. Claire and I met a few times after everything unfolded, mostly to coordinate our divorce proceedings. But during one meeting, as we sat in a quiet cafe, she looked up from her coffee and said, "Do you think they ever thought about the damage they were doing? To us? To everything we built?" I paused, considering her question. "I don't think they cared," I said finally. "People like that only think about what makes them feel good in the moment. They don't stop to think about who they're hurting." Claire nodded, her expression hardening. "Well, they know now." That conversation stayed with me. It wasn't just about them knowing, it was about me moving forward. I didn't want to live the rest of my life defined by their betrayal. The turning point came when I decided to reclaim my happiness. I reached out to old friends I'd drifted from during my marriage. I joined a local hiking group, rediscovering a love for the outdoors that I'd neglected over the years. Slowly, I started rebuilding my life, not as a husband defined by a broken marriage, but as a man who had survived it. One evening, as I sat on my porch, sipping a glass of bourbon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire. "I finalized everything today. Feels like a weight's been lifted." I smiled and typed back, "Same here. We made it through." The next morning, I drove by the house Emily and I had shared, now empty and ready to be sold. It was strange, seeing it like that, a shell of what it once was. But as I sat there, I realized I didn't feel sadness. What I felt was relief. Relief that I wasn't trapped in that life anymore. Relief that I could start over. And I wasn't alone in that. Claire had found her strength too. Together, we'd faced the storm, and together, we'd come out the other side. As I drove away, the weight on my chest finally lifted. The betrayal had left its scars, but it hadn't broken me. If anything, it had shown me how much I could endure, and how much better life could be when you refuse to settle for less than you deserve.